Good evening, I'm Rachel Maddow, and tonight we begin with a developing story that could reshape not only the Middle East but the global economy itself. What happens when a regional conflict stops being a regional conflict? What happens when diplomacy collapses, military strategies shift, and the stakes grow so large that the consequences reach far beyond the battlefield? Tonight, we're looking at the rapidly escalating tensions involving Iran, the United States, and Israel, and why analysts across the world believe this confrontation could evolve into something far bigger than a conventional war, from the strategy being discussed inside Tehran, to the political calculations unfolding in Washington and Jerusalem, to the economic ripple effects that may impact energy markets, global debt, and inflation worldwide. This is a story that is quickly becoming one of the defining geopolitical moments of our time. Let's begin with the latest signals coming from Tehran. In a recent interview broadcast on state television in Tehran, a senior Iranian official made a statement that immediately captured international attention. According to the remarks, Iranian leadership believes the possibility of negotiated peace has essentially vanished. Instead, officials indicated that if conflict continues, Iran is prepared for a prolonged struggle, one that could resemble the endurance warfare seen during the Iran-Iraq War. The message was blunt. Iran, they suggested, is willing to sustain a long conflict if necessary, and those comments were not made in isolation. Other influential voices within the Iranian government have echoed similar themes in recent days. Officials from Iran's national security leadership and foreign ministry have emphasized three central points. First, negotiations, at least for now, are not being considered a realistic path forward. Second, Iran appears to be preparing strategically for a prolonged confrontation rather than a short campaign. And third, the leadership has framed the conflict not merely as a military engagement, but as a broader struggle involving national sovereignty and regional power dynamics. Those statements, analysts say, reflect a significant shift in tone. Another development drawing attention is what Iranian officials describe as a decentralized defensive doctrine, sometimes referred to by analysts as a mosaic defense. Under traditional military command structures, strategic decisions typically move through a centralized chain of command. Orders originate from national leadership and flow downward through the military hierarchy. But under a decentralized structure, authority is distributed across regional commands. Iran is believed to have divided its territory into multiple operational regions, each commanded by local leadership capable of making rapid tactical decisions. That means local commanders could potentially respond independently in the event of communications disruptions or surprise attacks. Supporters of this model say it increases resilience during wartime. Critics argue it also raises the risk of unpredictable escalation. Either way, the shift illustrates how seriously Iranian leaders appear to be preparing for a prolonged conflict environment. Meanwhile, the military situation itself continues to evolve. Both sides have conducted a series of strikes and counterstrikes in recent days. Reports from regional sources describe missile launches, drone operations, and targeted attacks against military infrastructure. Advanced defense systems such as the THAAD have been deployed in an effort to intercept incoming threats. Yet several attacks are reported to have penetrated air defense networks, highlighting the complexity of modern missile warfare. Targets allegedly included military installations and transportation hubs, though independent verification of some claims remains difficult amid the fog of war. Casualty figures reported by various sources suggest hundreds of deaths and injuries on both sides, though exact numbers remain contested. And as the strikes continue, so does the uncertainty, because in modern conflict, the battlefield isn't limited to geography, it also extends into economics. Behind the military headlines lies another powerful force shaping the crisis: the global financial system. The United States currently carries one of the largest sovereign debt burdens in modern history. According to recent data from the International Monetary Fund, U.S. federal debt has surpassed $38 trillion. That number alone does not necessarily trigger crisis. Large economies often sustain high debt levels for long periods. But the key concern for economists is not just the size of the debt, it's the cost of servicing that debt. In recent fiscal years, interest payments alone have climbed dramatically. As global interest rates rise, the cost of borrowing increases, placing additional pressure on government budgets. And that's where geopolitical instability can intersect with financial markets. Historically, during periods of global uncertainty, investors often shift capital into what they consider safe haven assets. Those assets have traditionally included U.S. Treasury bonds, the U.S. dollar, and gold. If global tensions escalate dramatically, large flows of capital can move rapidly into these markets, sometimes strengthening demand for U.S. debt. But this time, analysts say the reaction has been more complicated. Instead of falling sharply as they often do during crises, yields on long-term U.S. Treasury bonds have actually risen. In recent trading sessions, higher yields mean investors are demanding greater returns to hold government debt. Why? One possible explanation involves inflation. If prolonged conflict disrupts energy supplies, particularly oil shipments through critical shipping routes like the Strait of Hormuz, global energy prices could surge. Higher oil prices tend to drive inflation across the entire economy, from transportation costs to consumer goods. Economists at several international banks have modeled potential scenarios. Some estimates suggest that a sustained rise in oil prices could push inflation rates significantly higher in major economies, including the United States. And that would put central banks in a difficult position. The Federal Reserve has spent the past several years attempting to control inflation through higher interest rates. If conflict pushes energy prices higher again, inflation could accelerate, forcing policymakers to keep rates elevated longer than expected, or even raise them. Further, higher rates, in turn, increase borrowing costs across the economy. Mortgages, business loans, credit markets all become more expensive. And that feedback loop can slow economic growth. In other words, a prolonged geopolitical crisis doesn't just affect foreign policy. It can shape domestic economic conditions as well. Meanwhile, leaders on all sides face their own political pressures. In Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been navigating intense domestic debate following recent conflicts in the region. Political analysts say his government faces both internal scrutiny and international criticism, placing enormous pressure on decision-making. For leaders in Washington and Tehran, the stakes are equally high. Military escalation carries enormous risk, but backing down can also carry political consequences. And so the conflict enters a dangerous stage, one in which each side believes it must maintain strength, even while hoping to avoid catastrophe. If the crisis were to expand further, the consequences could extend far beyond the Middle East. Energy markets would likely feel immediate shockwaves. Shipping routes across the Persian Gulf carry a significant share of the world's oil supply. Any disruption there could affect fuel prices worldwide. Higher energy costs could trigger inflation spikes across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Financial markets would react, central banks would respond, and global supply chains, already strained in recent years, could face additional pressure. In short, this is not simply a regional conflict. It is a potential global stress test. Some analysts believe prolonged geopolitical instability could accelerate broader shifts already underway in the international system. In recent years, several countries have explored diversifying financial reserves away from traditional assets. Central banks around the world have increased gold holdings and experimented with alternative settlement currencies. If global instability continues, those trends could intensify. Economic blocs could strengthen regional cooperation. Supply chains could shift toward greater self-sufficiency, and the international financial system, long dominated by the US dollar, could face new pressures and new competitors. None of those changes would happen overnight, but crises have a way of speeding up historical processes. So where does this conflict go from here? At the moment, that question remains impossible to answer. Military operations continue, diplomatic channels remain tense, and the economic implications are only beginning to unfold. History has shown that wars often develop in ways few leaders initially anticipate. What begins as a limited confrontation can expand rapidly or sometimes resolve unexpectedly through diplomacy. For now, the world is watching closely. Tonight's story reminds us how deeply interconnected our world has become. A missile strike in the Middle East can ripple through global energy markets. Political decisions in one capital can affect economic stability thousands of miles away. And in moments like this, the choices made by leaders carry consequences not just for their own nations, but for the entire international community. For now, the hope shared by many around the world remains simple, that diplomacy can still find a path forward before escalation reaches a point of no return. I'm Rachel Maddow. Thank you for joining us tonight. Stay with us for continuing coverage of this developing story.